I'd like to share a secret with you. In the 90s, rather than spending my hard-earned money on the latest cassette single or even album, I used to get hold of MIDI versions of the songs and play them on the Windows Media Player. The fact there was no singing didn't bother me. The fact that I only had an FM synthesis sound card didn't bother me. In fact, these things made the music more palatable, more enjoyable. I loved the fact that the little chunk of hardware in my PC's ISA slot was producing these sounds, and the grungy electronic pulse sounding instruments with crunching drum beats just added to that enjoyment. Fast forward 25 years and I'll load up Amazon Music or Spotify and stream songs. It's nice, but it's not the same. I miss those computer simulated instruments. The fact that games no longer have soundtracks which are bespoke and conjured by the hardware in your machine. You know, they have real music performed by real people, or melodies generated and recorded from other equipment, just detracts from what a personalised aesthetic gaming used to have. For example, Doom would sound different from machine to machine, and I liked that. It's not the same that I can't find 7 different variations of by the Crash Test Dummies, all with a slightly different composition, because the artist felt like recreating them that way. So what happened? Where did this wonderful world of MIDI disappear to? Well, I'll be exploring other parts, but I'm going to focus on MIDI in the sense of a general user in this video, the typical home PC user, rather than from the perspective of a composer. But even so, we still need to understand what MIDI is, and from that establish why it was so important at the time. Well, MIDI isn't a file, it's not a type of music. It's a communications protocol that stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. It allows you to connect a wide range of musical instruments, computers and other devices in between, usually with these 5-pin DIN plugs. So I can plug a keyboard into my Atari ST's MIDI port, press a key, and the note's notation, pitch, velocity, vibrato, panning, tempo, all the other features will be sent to the computer with no noticeable delay. Depending on your software and what is being communicated, the ST will record this information. It won't record the actual sound itself, just all the details it needs to reproduce what was played. So I can play a tune and then get the ST to play it back with a different instrument, or I can change one of the notes and send it back to the keyboard. It's pretty clever. Naturally, computers like the Atari ST had their own chips for sound and music in software, usually something like a PSG-based Yamaha AY chip, unless you were an Amiga owner, of course. A PSG chip tends to use some basic waveforms and a noise channel to create a very bleepy and harsh computer-like sound. However, this wasn't going to keep people satisfied forever, especially a new wave of PC gamers and composers. They needed something that would create realistic instrument sounds. For the PC, this initially meant Adlib's music synthesizer card, complete with a Yamaha YM3812 sound chip. Here we have hardware that can be driven to create reasonable instrument sounds. This was quickly copied by Creative Technology with their Sound Blaster card, which also added the ability to play PCM audio, perfect for both gaming and Windows. So if we go back to Windows 3.1 and open up Canyon.mid, this media player is sending the MIDI data from this .mid file to the Sound Blaster's Windows MIDI driver. This then maps the MIDI data against a sound bank, or patch map, of instrument sounds, and then tells the Sound Blaster's synthesis chip, in this case an OPL3, how to produce the sound. It's like the Sound Blaster is the instrument in this instance, or really a collection of instruments. The .mid file simply contains the instructions to tell the Sound Blaster which notes to play on which instruments and with what timing and effects. This is why MIDI music can sound so different depending on both your sound hardware and the software driver being used. It's also why DOS games contain so many different sound card choices to ensure music was output correctly. For a while, well even today in some instances, sound cards used their own instrument patch maps, but with the introduction of general MIDI in 1991, there was an accepted table of 128 instruments, which was adopted with varying degrees of compatibility by manufacturers either in hardware or software form. So when a MID file calls instrument 34 for example, we know it's going to be acoustic bass, or 54 is going to be the voice effect. So it's really working the same way this electronic keyboard is. Select an instrument, pick a note and a duration, play it, and then combine lots of these instructions and you get music. This Sound Blaster clone uses a technique called FM synthesis to recreate the composition fed to it. Frequency modulation synthesis does really what it says on the tin. Take a sine wave. Well, FM synthesis then uses a modulator to combine various waveforms with various frequencies to affect that original wave in ways that can approximate the sound of instruments, drums, and even vocals to a very limited extent. Like most Sound Blaster 16s, this card uses Yamaha OPL3 frequency modulation. This provided 18 2-operator FM channels in its basic form, but could convert 3 of the channels into a 5-channel percussion set, and it sounds pretty decent. But if you were flash with the cash in the 90s, you might have a Wavetable synthesis sound card. Now, I'm far from an authority on this, but Wavetable synthesis is actually somewhat a misappropriation of the meaning when it comes to most sound cards. Generally, it's a sound synthesis technique not too dissimilar from FM, but with much more advanced oscillators that can employ phase distortion, folding, and other sophisticated techniques. The table refers to the table of different wave types which are employed in advanced ways. It's often used in high-end synthesizers, but Wavetable sound cards like this IBM 16-bit DSP card actually store PCM wave samples of all the instruments it needs on board, so it's literally a lookup table of wave samples. Combine that with our friendly FM synthesis chip, and the output sounds much more akin to real-life instruments and a real-life performance. Here's a Sound Blaster AWE64 from 1997, which is pretty similar, and basically a revision of what was considered the gaming gold standard, the AWE32. If I install it and compare the difference with my Sound Blaster clone, you can see what I mean. It sounds richer and much more like a real-life performance. Although personally I'll always have a soft spot for the cheap robotic raspy tones of FM synthesis. It just felt more atmospheric in some implementations compared to the sometimes too clean and tapered instrument sounds of Wavetable. Although often Wavetable would knock FM out of the park. But whatever card you have, you'll get a slightly different sound depending on the samples it uses or how it synthesizes the output. If you had a professional external MIDI device, you could even use that with the Windows MIDI mapper to send signals directly. Cards like the Sound Blaster AWE32 or 64 were some of the first to also include sound font support. Based on EMU's high-end sampler setups, the AWE could not only apply effects to its MIDI output, such as reverb and chorus, you could also load custom sound sets onto its onboard RAM, allowing you to mix in a custom piano set or something even funkier into the mix. At this point, the MIDI output of these little cards almost sounded like the real deal. A lot of work was going into making them sound as rich as possible. Pretty impressive. If you were lucky enough to have a Roland MT32, then that was a really special sound. But one of the main benefits of having the sound card produce all the music is that MID files are tiny in size. Since all they contain are instructions, rather than actual samples, you can fit hundreds of tunes on a single floppy disk. So, as well as allowing you to have an extensive library on a 50 megabyte hard drive, it meant that games could have as much background music as they needed, whilst still sounding pretty sweet. Until the compact disc came along that it was really possible to have real in-game music. This music was usually recorded directly as CD audio tracks, necessitating for the CD to be inserted whilst playing the game. So that's great, it meant we could have 9 Inch Nails as the backing track for Quake, or if we had a pirated version of Quake, well, we could just use our copy of Prodigy's Fat of the Land instead, because that sounded equally as good. But CD audio was limiting. If you think back to games like Star Wars TIE Fighter for DOS, it employed real-time dynamic use of MIDI to change the music depending on the on-screen action. This was called the iMuse engine, and relied on leitmotifs or short musical riffs which interconnect, allowing the energy of your experience to change at will. Later collector's editions would actually replace this with a looping version of the original soundtrack, which was frankly just crap in comparison. With CD audio, you just can't have that same experience. You're stuck with the same music spinning around until you go to the next level and the game instructs the CD to skip to another audio track. But it became the norm regardless. The inclusion of CD players in multimedia computers also allowed us to consume our own music through our favourite beige box. We could even have an on-screen equalizer to accompany it. And if we wanted, we could even watch music videos directly on our desktops. This for me was the peak of the multimedia PC, and indeed for sound cards. More than just providing MIDI playback and audio connectors, sound cards provided a gateway to the multimedia PC. You could plug a joystick into them, you could connect your CD-ROM drive to them, or the audio at least. They were an essential part of the home computer. Then, as the late 90s drew us closer, even as we listened to that sweet Grand Theft Auto soundtrack, chopping and changing as we switched vehicle, a new type of music container appeared, MP3, along with other smaller encoding methods, and with these an alternative for not just in-game music, but music in general. MP3 might have hit the ground in 1993, but it wasn't really until the late 90s that it became useful. Using lossy data compression, formats like MP3 managed to squeeze the actual digital audio into a much smaller file format than anything prior. With advancing processor power and larger hard disks, these new compression methods would prove useful, not just for in-game audio but for playing and indeed recording music on a computer. Anyone who used services like Napster or Kazaa will likely remember amassing a nice collection of pirate music at the time. But even with this new kid on the block, MIDI was still incredibly useful, albeit mainly for musicians looking to compose or create. But thanks to USB, musicians didn't need the joystick connector on the back of their sound cards, which often doubled as a MIDI port to plug a keyboard or synth for guitar into. They didn't even need MIDI capability on their sound cards. They had professional equipment to take care of that. And even if lowly general users still wanted it, well, improvements in processor speed meant that Wavetable could now be handled entirely in software, and then output as digital audio. And so the MIDI component of the sound card started to fade away. We were moving into a new era, an era free of .mid files, an era where a separate sound card wasn't even necessary, mainly because motherboard chipsets started integrating their own audio. Enter AC97, or Audio Codec 97, a standard developed by Intel for integration directly into motherboards. AC97 consisted of a controller connected by a digital link to a codec chip that would convert the digital signals to analog, allowing you to spew them out of your speakers. A chip known as the South Bridge would normally be used for controlling, whilst various manufacturers created the codec chips, including Cirrus Logic, Philips, Yamaha, but the main ones would quickly become Realtek and Analog Devices, also known as SoundMax. Due to the changes in how the average user was consuming media, the AC97 standard didn't even have a hardware requirement for MIDI playback, and so it was instead handed over to software. In fact, the Microsoft GS Wavetable synth has been a core component of the Windows operating system from Windows 98 onwards. Originally licensed from Roland in 1996 and based on their 1991 Wavetable sound set, it synthesizes MIDI playback entirely through software, much like the AWE32 had the ability to do. Of course, this burdens the CPU and introduces an element of lag, but also it's a rudimentary implementation lacking the features and audio quality that even modest sound cards had 20 years ago. But even to this day, it's the standard MIDI device for Windows, although it's not always installed out of the box. But it's the MIDI device that emulators such as DOSBox or SCUM VM will use unless you install an improved open source alternative. In terms of real DOS support, well, DOS doesn't really support AC97 unless a piece of software is specifically written to talk to the hardware directly, but this was now an era of Windows drivers and middleware, a post-DOS era, and sadly a post-MIDI era. In 2004, Intel released high-definition audio to replace the AC97 standard, again lacking any requirement for MIDI hardware simply because we'd moved on. But it did improve on the non-MIDI side of things, with up to 15 input and outputs and 16 PCM audio channels per stream, among a slew of other nice features. So games could make use of that, and so could musicians, and I guess I could just make do with cover versions of the crash test dummies to drown my sorrows. But through this mist, and despite people not really needing to buy sound cards anymore, manufacturers like Sound Blaster soldiered on, albeit a somewhat shadow of their former selves. Following the trend, most of their post-millennium sound cards would gradually do away with MIDI support, but cards like Sound Blaster Live would continue to hold the flame for MIDI and sound font support. Even better, the higher spec cards, such as the Creative Sound Blaster Order GRX, still have pretty darn nice hardware MIDI support even today. In fact, this has 2 built-in MIDI synthesizers and full sound font capability. I picked this one up direct from Amazon for about 50 quid, so let's install it in my office PC and see how it sounds. Okay, I've got a really cool sponsor for today's video. Yes, I've really been enjoying delving into the world of Brilliant. Now, Brilliant is a world full of masterful interactive storytellers, and you enter these worlds through dabbling in maths and science. Say you want to dabble in frequency modulation, it seems apt. Well, at the core of understanding sine waves is understanding calculus, and with Brilliant you can dive right into that with calculus in a nutshell, packed with examples and games to help you get your head around. Or if you'd like to get started on learning computer science and programming, you could explore the computer science fundamentals. Here we have to guide the drone to the correct barn using programming loops. It brings back memories of using Logo. So through these interactive experiences, the laws that shape our world will be illuminated to you, allowing you to develop your intuition and understanding. Go to brilliant.org/nostalgianerd to sign up for free, with the first 200 people getting 20% off premium annual membership. Be warned though, it's very addictive. Very. Eh? Of course, you can get better sound cards even today, such as the Asus Essence STX2, which reportedly has some spiffing MIDI capability on board. But there's something so nostalgic about the Creative Labs brand for me that it gives me a warm feeling to still be using it. Sure, MIDI might not have progressed how I hoped it would, in fact, it almost died out, but I feel like bringing MIDI back. To this corner of my office, at least. I could quite happily sit here and while away the hours to literal megabytes and megabytes of .mid files. Digital audio workstation and VST technology might be replacing the world of MIDI, or it might seem like they are. But on Sunday, January the 19th, 2020, at the annual meeting of the MIDI Manufacturers Association, the complete suite of MIDI 2.0 specifications were adopted unanimously by the MMA members in attendance. So MIDI really is coming back. Kind of. It might not be FM synth, but I'm sure it'll be just fine. Thanks for watching and have a great